I think you could make an argument that Ford is less establishment than either the Liberals or the NDP.
People are working more than one job, or they have a full-time job and a side hustle. So where are you going to find the time to really get engaged in politics, let alone run?
Hi, and welcome to a special Friday edition of The Missing Middle. I'm Meredith Martin. On Monday, I asked Mike and Sabrina to make some predictions about the outcome of the Ontario provincial election, and today we get to find out if they were right or not. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. So I've been thinking a lot about the provincial election because it's happening on Thursday, and all three of us have been following Ontario politics for a really long time. And I want to get your thoughts on and predictions on whether or not you think Ford will walk away with the majority, which is basically the general consensus today on Monday. What do you think?
Yeah, not only do I think he'll get a majority, he could get close to 100 seats. I think both the Liberals and NDP are going to have trouble retaining party status in the legislature. They need 12 seats in order to do that. The Liberals went into the election with fewer than 12 seats, so that wouldn't be a change, but the NDP had significantly more. So, yeah, I think this is not much of a race at all. I think it's just a question of how large is Ford's next majority going to be.
Absolutely. At this point, Ford is on track for a majority. Like Mike said, the only question is how big. And I guess the real race is for second, who clinches that, the Liberals or the NDP. But unfortunately, the opposition parties just haven't been very competitive. So Ford hasn't had to really compete hard or put forward any really bright, bold new policy ideas this election cycle.
Given that the three of us care a lot about the housing file and that Mike gave the Ford government a D and Sabrina an F on housing, how are you guys thinking about that issue right now? Why do you think it's not resonating with voters in any sort of meaningful way enough to change the outcome of an election?
It comes down to a couple things. I think, for one thing, people have been distracted by what's going on south of the border and the threat of tariffs and everything else going on since Trump became president. So that has become, in many cases, the number one ballot issue. But right behind that is still cost of living, and housing is a major problem. But I don't think we've seen a really substantive policy debate around the issue because, in part, I don't think it's something that Doug Ford particularly wants to talk about. And I don't think we've seen very strong platforms come out of the Ontario Liberals or the NDP, nor do we have leaders at the helm of either of those parties who have been able to effectively communicate the problem with the electorate. On top of that, it's a winter election. People are just tuned out. It's been a really chaotic and exhausting news cycle. So there's some fatigue on the part of, I think, media and voters. So you bring all those factors together, and unfortunately, housing has been on the back burner despite being, in my view, the province's number one issue.
I absolutely agree that I think the Greens have a pretty decent housing proposal, but they're or platform, but they're the Greens. They have two seats, and they're hoping to get a third out of this. Unfortunately, neither the NDP nor the Liberals have put out much of a meaningful housing plan. Neither of the leaders have a lot of personal credibility when it comes to housing. They're not somebody either one of them. Merritt Stiles doesn't have much of a background in that area, and Crombie's record is mixed at best in Mississauga. So you have a case where they don't have much in the way of policy, and they don't have much of a positive background in the area that it allows kind of Ford and the Conservatives to, kind of win this by default. It's really not that competitive. So it is unfortunate that we're not having more of a housing debate in this election.
So my third and final question is something that I've been thinking about for so long, which is that the housing crisis impacts young people more than it impacts older people, and older people are more likely to vote. But I've been thinking about the boomer generation for many years now, and they were the largest cohort at that time, and they really flipped the bird to establishment and to their parents and got engaged with the political process. And I think about former Premier Bob Rae, who became the head of the NDP when he was 34 years old and Premier of the province when he was 42, and then went on to a substantial federal career. And my question is, like, where are the millennial politicians? Why aren't millennials engaging more in the political process? And I guess I'd like, Sabrina, for you to speak for all millennials at this time.
Well, I don't think I can speak for all millennials, but there are a lot of barriers to running for office these days. I mean, you have to take time off usually from a job or quit a job to campaign. That's a big financial sacrifice. Renting, by its very nature, many young people are renters, which means you might have lived in different ridings over the last few years, or you don't live in a riding that's viable for a party that you'd like to run for, versus someone who's older, who has owned their home and been in the community for 30 years. They have a natural advantage, whether it comes to winning a nomination or a general election. So those very practical elements are a barrier to young people getting involved. But I think part of it is politics isn't attracting young people as much anymore, because it is very toxic and partisan in nature these days. And anything you do or say online is picked apart by everyone, taken to very toxic extremes. So that turns people off. But also, again, coming down to cost of living. I mean, young people are just trying to survive economically by and large right now. So they're trying to pay rent or meet their grocery bills or raise their young family. A lot of people are working more than one job, or they have a full-time job and a side hustle. So where are you going to find the time to really get engaged in politics, let alone run after that? And I do think that's having major impacts on our ability to address and solve some of these issues, particularly housing, because we just don't have leaders with the practical experience on how bad this issue really is, how it's impacting people, and what some of the solutions should be.
Yeah, I think that that's all fair. Though I would say that there are a lot of young people involved. Look even federally, right? Pierre Poilievre is technically a Gen X, but he's kind of Zennial. He's straddles the two generations. Karina Gould is running for the Liberal leadership on a millennial kind of forward platform. I know it's taking generations, but there is a ever shrinking proportion of old white guys in the legislature. It's probably only about 70% instead of 90%, but it is going down. I think the big thing is that who is the anti-establishment to vote for? I think you could make an argument that Ford is less establishment than either the Liberals or the NDP. And you actually see that in some of the polling data, that younger folks are actually voting for conservatives. And, that's not necessarily the case around the world. But you do see in countries where there are more extreme options that young people are often going for those, in part because of that dissatisfaction. So I would disagree somewhat. Like I do think there are some significant barriers preventing millennials and Gen Z from entering politics or being more politically involved. But I also think, the system, there's no anti-establishment candidate. And again, frankly, if there is, it's probably Doug Ford.
I do think you hit on a good distinction there, that there are still some younger people in politics, yes, but often they are very establishment candidates, people who have been staffers since high school or involved in the party, even though they're only 35 years old for 20 years. And so that's the distinction there. I don't think we're seeing a lot of younger people enter politics who haven't been volunteers or part of the party since a very young age, and who don't have those establishment connections or don't already come from very wealthy and comfortable backgrounds that allow them to be able to run. And that does change the perspective of the type of young people we're getting in politics.
I do think a lot of it comes down to rent. So when I think about when I was 18 years old, I had a friend who, couldn't stand living with her parents and moved out and got an apartment in a very kind of sleazy at the time part of Toronto and worked as a waitress. And she could make rent and live in the second most expensive city in the country, even at that time. And I think you'd see a lot more people participating if they could, live independently more easily.
Well, and also if you look at political salaries these days, they just don't hold up with the cost of living for young people. So if you look at what a city councilor makes, what an MPP makes, even an MP, I mean, you're still not at the level where you're able to afford a single family home or even perhaps a condo in the riding you might be running in. So that's pretty wild as well.
I've heard MPPs complain about their low salaries. And I'm like, but you could vote to raise your salaries, and they never do.
Well, I think that the fear is that they would get unelected. So yeah, they could raise their salary, but they no longer have the job. So yay, the guy after me is getting a raise. Fantastic. And rent, yeah, absolutely. Like there, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a thing. And if you are worried about, how you're going to afford groceries or pay the rent, that kind of crowds out your ability to be worried about other things like voting or being involved in the political process. And that's one of the real challenges of the housing crisis is it crowds out all these other crises. Like it's hard to get young people to care about climate change and go, okay, 30 years from now we're going to have all these problems, or where they're like 30 hours from now I'm going to have all these problems. Like I don't care about 30 years from now. So I think it shows the importance of dealing with the housing and affordability crises, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to solve all of these other issues that society has.
Yep, I think that's a good place to leave it. We'll see if we're right on Friday. And don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.